Welcome to the Driving Change podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Welcome back to the Driving Change podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. Today's really amazing guest, I'm excited for you to hear from. And I just met this gentleman, but I can tell you where this gentleman comes from because many of you know Dr. Dan on our team. And Dan came to me not too long ago and he's like, you've got to meet this gentleman. He is just amazing. He's right in line with what we believe and teach. And I will tell you, Tony Dottino has done an amazing amount of work in the same fields we have, from neuroscience to organizational change management. He's the head and founder of the Dottino Consulting Group, founder of the USA Memory Championship. He's been a key influencer and thought leader in strategic application of neuroscience to organizations throughout the globe, really, and how to apply them in a meaningful way. They specialize in culture change, brain-to-brain communication, so you can see why I was intrigued and interested, process innovation. He's authored 2 books, and you're going to go get them both because you're going to love them. He's authored The Brain Smart Leader and Grassroots Leader, the Brain Smart Revolution in Business. So whether you're an executive, whether you're a stay-home parent, whether you're trying to coach your kids' Little League team better, what you're going to find from Tony today is he's got a ton of value in how we show up every day, the mindset required to drive change, and what we can learn about ourselves through his story. I think you'll find inspirational. So, Tony, welcome to the Driving Change podcast.
Great to be with you. God, I got so excited working with Dan, and then when he introduced me to you, and I did a little bit of research on you, I'm like, my goodness, this is like too unbelievable to believe it's real, but it is, and we're here today.
Well, we are super excited to have you on. I can't wait to unpack your story with you. So, you know, the guests get a one warning, and the listeners are they're excited. We get a lot of feedback on. We can't wait to hear that the guest origin story. So you're going to get your first question, which I gave you a forewarning on. Take us back in time to the early days of little Tony Dottino and some of how you grew up and your story and the values and who influenced them and really what was the foundation that led to who you became today? Tell us that story.
I get a little teary-eyed because it comes from my dad. And my dad was an Italian person who just believed in helping people. And so where we lived was close to the harbors of New York City, Statue of Liberty. And as people would come in, as you would say, he'd go off the boat, he'd find them work, he'd find them jobs and places to live, he'd get them the car. And I learned it didn't matter who you were, the diversity of where you were coming from. If you needed help, my dad was there. And so now my dad ran a milk business. Okay. And so we go to the farm and get the milk and the cows, and we'd come back and I'd get on the truck and go deliver it to people's houses. And that was, for me, hard work. First of all, I couldn't figure out how to milk a cow if you paid me for it. I mean, so I'd go to the farm and they'd say, hey, get on the udder and here's the pail. And I'm like, thank goodness we have electric machines today that do that. But my goodness, I couldn't fill up a pail of milk if you left me there all day long. And so as I delivered milk and I got through high school, I used to hate snow days because if it were snowing and I didn't go to school, I was up at 4:30 in the morning delivering milk in the snow and the sleet. And boy, I preferred, there were better things to do. So I went to college. And my dad wanted a college boy. So the family called me the golden boy because I was one of his 4 children that took the college path. And so off I went to college, and I talked to cousin of mine who's a PhD out of Michigan, brilliant guy. And I went and sat with him. I said, cuz, what should I do when I go to college? And he said, if you like numbers and you like to work with figures, sign up for an accounting program. And it's because you'll be the last person out the door whenever they close up the business, telling everybody what the final numbers were. So I went and I took an accounting curriculum for 4 years and graduated with a 4.0 GPA. And I was offered all kinds of different jobs to go work with consulting firms and accounting firms. And I heard so much about people getting divorced that I decided, you know what? Somebody at IBM that knew me at college and said, you need to come work at IBM. And so off I went to IBM, where it was respect for the individual and the customer is always right. And so that's how I got myself started and started raising my family and things. But my dad gave me the values of caring for people. And so when people ask me, what is it that, you should be retiring? What is it that you keep driving to? And my passion is making a difference in teaching people things that can make a difference in their lives. And so people say, so what is your purpose? I've got my clients, I've always said to me, you're a phenomenal educator. You love to teach. And so you're not a salesman, because we throw salesmen out of here as fast as we can see them. But you're a teacher. And the more you teach, the more we want, because we think you've got so much more here that you can offer to us. So I've had a number of CEOs tell me, you've got to be one of the world's best teachers. And it just comes from my passion for wanting to make a difference. And I got that from Dad, bringing people from different countries and giving them a living and a job and a workplace. And when my dad passed, there were people of all denominations at his funeral, and we were all crying together. And as people said, we never worked for your dad, we worked with him. And that became my model of how I wanted to be a leader and executive at IBM. And so I worked at IBM for almost 28 years. And then my son, Michael, convinced me to put my hand up on one of their early retirement programs and go out and start my own consulting business, because I was involved with creating the origins of Six Sigma. And I helped somebody draft the Malcolm Baldrige Award for President Reagan. And so I was being asked by IBM to go share this with other companies in these big seminars as keynote speaking. And people were coming up to me, can I have your card? Can you come and teach this to our company? And somebody finally can put their arm around me and said, you need to leave IBM and go set up your own consulting firm.
That's amazing. And I love having folks on who have your kind of track record of experience, because I was talking to my nephew earlier today, and he's in his early 30s, and he's really just starting to get his traction out there. He's an entrepreneur. And we think back on our days when we were 30, and man, if we could just take all of our years of wisdom and experience and go back and give it to our 30-year-old self or our 27-year-old self. But that's just not how the world works, right? So experiences through these learned events. And I love also your story of your father. And we do, and I think Dan might even share this with you, we love helping leaders unpack their leadership why by going back and talking about who were those sages in their life that had significant influence in those different chapters of their life. And for many of us, we've had some influence in that 0 to 18 or 0 to 20 period of our life that many times we don't even realize the significant influence they had at creating these core values. And for you, hard work, education, serving other people, I mean, that to have that kind of experience in such a unique way, it warms my heart, but it also tells me a lot about you as a man and as a person as well, why you're so passionate about still giving back today. So that's amazing.
My other half sometimes say, she says, you'll listen to me talking with people. And she said, and what are you charging them? I said, let's not have that conversation.
Right.
She says, do you realize how much you give away? I said, you know what? If it's made a difference and it can create a behavioral change or a life change in somebody's life with their kids or their spouse, because I'll do a lot of people will see me in a workshop and they'll say, can I buy you a cup of coffee? Right. So I'll sit down with a cup of tea and they'll tell me a little bit. And I say, hey, why don't you try this or you try that? And one of the things people say is you live what you teach, which is what we most respect about how authentic you are, because as we test you for the things you do, we find that you teach it. And so one of my best clients came from somebody in one of my workshops, and he came up to me and he said, do you believe in everything you just taught us? And I said, I sure do. He says, well, I've got some feedback I'd like to give you on some things that you might want to change in your delivery. And I'm like, all ears, tell me, I'm open to it. He says, you're not going to hit me, are you? I said, no. I said, he gave me some feedback. And again, the stars and the gods line up sometimes. And the next week I'm with a client and I'm in that same situation. And I took his advice and went there. And I wound up with a $500,000 contract.
Isn't that awesome? But you were open. You were open to the feedback.
I was open to the feedback. And one of the things in the neuroscience world, and this is so insane in my IBM experiences, the sad part for me is, as you talk about going back to your early days, if you only knew what you knew. If I only knew what I know today, when I was working for John Akers at IBM, I would have gone into his office and said, John, you've surrounded yourself with the yes team, and they're deadly. Because nobody wanted to tell him the truth. Why? Because they didn't want to upset him.
Right.
If you would have looked at him on his last day sitting at the microphone, he looked like a sad, depressed gentleman. And he was phenomenal. I love John Akers. He had a vision for IBM that Gershon just took and moved forward. But John he surrounded himself with the wrong people. And I always remember going into one of the presentations that I did with the big guys in the room. And when I was all done, his assistant comes out to me and he said, you are never coming in here and doing that again. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, you upset him. And I look at the guy and I said, but I told him the truth.
Right.
But you upset him. Do you realize how tough the rest of this meeting is going to be? And nobody wants you to come back.
Isn't that the case for a lot of, and this, I don't want to go too far off track. We'll get there in a second. I want to ask you about, when did you get so interested in exploring the world of neuroscience relative to communication, leadership, management, organizational change? Because you started as an accountant, then, the degree in accounting, then you moved over, like accountants and neuroscience don't always go together. Then you moved into IBM. And you probably started to recognize obviously Lean and Six Sigma, and you were one of the grandfathers or fathers of that. When did the neuroscience piece come into play for you?
So I'll give you the short version. I was a finance guy Phil Crosby sold this thing called the cost of quality. So he tells our president, I need a finance guy to come work with me to do the cost of quality report for the IBM company. I was a new guy in the department. So I got, as people joked with me, you got the short straw. You're going to go learn all about this quality stuff, and you're going to Winter Park, Florida, to attend a 1-week class. Short story, I went there, I started calculating the IBM cost of quality, and the numbers were staggering. Meaning, what Crosby was saying is what you need to be able to do is go look at your accounting systems and go look at your operations, and you need to see how much money and time is spent on failure costs. And at that time, he's selling about 2 to 3% of your gross revenue. And I'm going into our IBM locations, our service locations, even our sales locations, and I'm finding that it is not 3%. In fact, it's more like, how about 20?
Wow.
We had departments just said it. So that's when I got crazy about this, right? And so I bring this back to the president. Unfortunately, I had a CFO that time that said, before you go in, we're going to get you blessed. Because when you put these numbers up in front of these guys, you're going to take the bullets, and I'm not going to let that happen. So we're going to get you a shield, and you're going to go to each division controller and get their blessing that your numbers are probably lower than they should be, because I was very conservative. And so I finally got in and presented that. But then that led me, Akers then said to me one day, for what you've done for manufacturing and for our sales and servicing business, can you go in and do this in the white collar departments? Because if it's as bad as it is for areas we focused on and we have quality control, what's it look like in our infrastructure departments, which is now half of our, so I went and did a financial analysis and found half of our work and money was spent on infrastructure. So I started a series of 17 different studies. That's where I started to learn what I call process innovation skills. Because I started linking departments and seeing in the flow of how work was done, what it was costing us. And I started to realize if I could see what was going on at the end and bring it back earlier in the cycle, I could reduce the cycle and I could reduce the cost and exceed the delivery dates. Now, I've got all these numbers and I'm wondering what's going on. So my CFO looks at a brochure one day, he calls me into his office and I'm like, oh God, what did I do? And he said, look, we got a guy by the name of Tony Busan who's coming to the American Management Association, and he's doing a 3-day seminar on creativity. And everything you're telling me is we need to figure out how to re-engage our employees and get creativity back into our process. So we go to New York City for 3 days, and here's Tony Busan hosting a 3-day seminar on creativity. Now, Tony's a psychologist, comes out of London. He's written more than 80 books. Tony is one of the foremost minds that mentored me as I got to meet him. So we go for this 3-day seminar, and I'm sitting down with him after me and 3 other IBM executives went out for dinner. I'd call him. He'd say, hey, let's go have a drink. And I'd sit at the bar with him, and I'd get a club soda, and he'd be drinking stuff, and we'd be at the bar until 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was like a sponge. I wanted to, like, he was the neuroscience guy. He was like the he knew. I always said to Tony, I said, you've got a 5-year crystal ball on where people's heads are at and where it's going to be in 5 years. I said, I want to know how you do that, because you can predict the future better than any seer I've ever met, or any fortune teller or whatever, and you're accurate about it. And so as I spent 3 nights with him, he said to me on the last night, he said, you got to pick up the phone, call my office, and you got to come to West Palm, Florida, and you got to learn what I'm doing, because you're going to become the Tony Busan of the United States. And I'm like, you're really, like, for sure, I'm going to be. And I'm looking at this guy. He's got 80 books. He's got his name. He's charging $50,000 for a day.
Back then.
And he's talking to me back then.
Yeah.
He was in Forbes magazine as one of the 3 most sought after speakers in the world. Now, here's the problem. He was so respected in China, Japan, in the Asian countries, in Europe. He came to the United States. What the hell does this English guy know about anything? The sadness. So we think we know everything, and he thinks he's got it, and he's going off to other countries. And I'm saying, my goodness. So I brought him into IBM. And the next thing he starts telling me is what we're going to learn about the human brain in the next 10 years is going to dispel and create myths of half of what we thought we knew. Mm. One of which was people think that their memories are fixed at birth. Bull. Your memory is a skill. So I learned the word memory is not a noun, it's a verb. Meaning there are things you can do to improve your memory. Now, here's what caught me. I went to this seminar to learn about creativity. The first thing he asked us was, what's the primary asset of the company? And everybody says it's humans in their brains. So then he says, so tell me what the brain's formula is for creativity. Now, these are 44 U.S. executives fumbling and what's the brain's formula? I had been to so many creativity where I had Bono and his thinking hats, and we had all these guys with the creativity. And here's Busan saying, what's the brain's formula for creativity? And the short answer is memory plus new information equals spontaneous combustion, a whole bunch of new ideas. Let's go back and define memory. So memory doesn't start when you first put it in. You have to be thinking of how you're going to put it in. So how will you encode the information into your brain so you create hooks for it so that when you want to retrieve it, you facilitate it by just an instant hook and pull it out, and now you match it to something you've just heard, something you've just read, something that's in a meeting, and bam, you have spontaneous combustion. It's your source of creativity. But you have to have the hooks, you have to be able to recall, and then you have to be able to do 1 + 1. And so he says, what's the brain's formula for 1 + 1? Meaning one thought with one new idea equals infinity. Like, whoa, what do you mean infinity? So we got a biology lesson on brain cells. Do we know how many brain cells we have? And do we know what the chemistry is of those and why oxygen and chemistry are important to a brain cell? Like now we're learning about diets and aerobics and whatever as the secret sauce to feeding your brain cells. And if you don't have the right food and you don't have the right oxygen, so he goes on, a healthy body's a healthy mind and a healthy mind's a healthy body. You need aerobics because your brain's using 1/4 of your oxygen. So if you're not aerobically fit, and so now we're talking about in IBM, talking about fitness programs. And I'm like, whoa, this is like insane. We're talking creativity. My passion was, how do we get people to be more creative? And here we're learning about fundamentals of, and again, we use, I have found that I don't always like to use the word neuroscience because people look at you like a space cadet sometimes. And they look at you like, all right, you're one of those science guys. And some of our science in the last few years have not done justice for science. So people say, well, it's always changing. So I've learned to say, so our experience or our research has revealed these results. And so now we go back to, okay, so I'm looking for creativity. And then the third thing that Busan taught me was this thing called mind maps. How do we map a mind in a way that if you take it and you draw it and sketch it out, and then you're using now he's teaching me about multiple senses and how multiple senses impact creativity. So what are we seeing? What are we touching? What are we externalizing? And that he uses the thing called mind maps, which he created years ago. And I wonder to this day why we don't teach this in schools as a fundamental learning tool.
Well, there's a lot of things we don't teach in schools that we should be teaching, right? So
right on. So now I'm mixing all of this together and I'm putting it back with my process work, because now I'm saying, okay, how do I use this to improve the yield of a process? How do I use it to take this string of silos and get people to be creative and collapse the cycle and collapse so guess where they send me, which turned out to be a blessing. They said, you know what, we got problems in Argentina. You need to go to Buenos Aires and go work with the manufacturing groups there and the sales teams there and whatever. So off you go to Argentina. Now, I go to Argentina to teach them the process and the brain stuff. And the next thing I know is the Argentina plants are creating the best products of any IBM location in the world. Now, here comes a moral dilemma I get. We're going to close some IBM US plants because Argentina is now outproducing us.
look what you did, Tony. Are you happy?
No, there's the dilemma, Jeff, because
right.
Wait a minute, I'm working for IBM.
Yeah.
We're closing IBM plants because they then send me to Mexico. I do the same damn thing in Mexico. Now, here's what people told me that worked in the IBM's Latin American divisions. When you come to these countries, you're like heaven sent. They think of you as a god. They pick me up at the airport. They drive me to hotels. They take me out to dinners. When they talk to the people with me, they hear, you're Tony Dottino. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? I'm telling you, yeah, I know who I am. But no, you don't know who you are to these people. They will come out of the mountains and they will stay just to learn from you what you are going to teach them. And they're like students. And plus, you speak English, and they want to be able to speak English if they're going to grow into higher level jobs. So I wind up going all over Latin America doing this stuff. And then we closed up plants that Mexico was out producing and stuff. And so at one point, I eventually got to go to Japan, right? Because now IBM was losing focus in Japan and losing our leadership. And so I go to this huge auditorium in Japan, and the head of IBM Japan comes up to me during a break. And he says, there are some people that they're paying attention to you. They may look like they're sleeping, but I want you to know they worked all night shift and they heard you were here and they wanted to see and listen to you.
Wow.
And I'm in Japan doing this stuff. And so I'm creating this in IBM, one after another. And the secret sauce I had was taking this touch of creativity. And again, I used to call it about your brain. So I did brain science. And I'm teaching them about first, what's the unlimited power of the human mind? How many of you think it's fixed? How many people think your memories are fixed and there's nothing that you can learn about it? How many think, by the way, who thinks that the older you get, the less creative you are?
Yeah, it should be the opposite, right?
Exactly. Science will tell you it's totally opposite because what? Back to Busan's formula, right? He taught me the formula. Life experience plus new information, pow. What are we doing at IBM at this time? We're letting all the wrong people go. We're letting all the people go that had all the life experiences, that have been down the pathways and the roadways that were with minefields and those that work. And what are we doing? I put my hand up and I left.
So hold on a second. Let me call time out because I want to unpack a few things. So I'm thinking if I'm a listener right now, and I want people to catch this. You had this. For most of us, there are moments in our life. There are moments. Some moments are small, some moments are medium, some moments are large. Some moments are redirectionally significant. So you had a moment when you got called into New York City to go to this workshop that you had been assigned to. And just by complete happenstance, which by the way, you and I both agree doesn't exist. There's a divine purpose for everything that happens. You meet Tony Busan, Am I saying the name right?
Busan. It's Busan. Busan.
Busan. And from that moment forward, the entire course of your career and life's direction changed.
Totally.
One moment, one trip, one meeting transformed the way that you viewed everything. And then because of your skills in process and organizational thinking, you already had those, right? So I want the listeners to think about, you've been acquiring knowledge and skills your whole life as you've walked down this path. And then you have these moments where you get introduced to people or to places or to events, and they're supposed to accelerate now your purpose. You had that happen in New York City, and like steroids or like rocket fuel, it just transformed the impact that you've had on the world ever since.
Totally. And here's where that came from. I had always thought, again, the values, wherever they come from, I was never using all of my brain. I had read enough about, we're not using everything in our brain, whatever. And here's Busan telling us about the potential of our brain and how we can access it. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's hope for me? I mean, I can, and I said that. I said to him at one of our drinks, I said, Tony, what you're telling me is there's hope for me. He said, without a doubt.
Well, I get told all the time by lots of people I'm not using all of my brain, but I don't know that it's they're telling me I have. I'm not saying they think I have opportunity to. I think that's more of an insult, but no, I'm kidding.
Yes, there's hope for you. I got to tell you that.
Thank you. This could be a moment for me, Tony. You're giving me that moment.
It could be. But that was the change, because then I had Dr. Paul Brown, a psychologist who had been actually in with me at IBM, helping me to find the behavioral changes needed place. And so I put some work together based on what I learned at Busan. And I went up to his place up in New Paltz, New York, and I sat with him and I shared with him. I said, Paul, I want to drop this into the teaching, meaning the neuroscience that Busan was sharing with us about the brain. I had these booklets and I started pulling graphs. And he said, Tony, there's the secret sauce that's going to engage people into doing this tedious stuff called process improvement. And that's going to be the energy that's going to propel the creativity that you've been looking for.
I love it. And I think, and you know, our purpose and our passion here at Brain Trust around the neuroscience, especially effective with respect to effective communication. And I can't help but think, I'm not the smartest cat in the world, right? I grew up on a farm and first person to go to college, directly out of high school. You know my story a little bit. But I always had this feeling, like you did, that if we're put on this planet for a purpose and we're all these kind of sack of meat suits, but we have this operating system called a brain, and it's the key that gets all human behavior to happen, then why don't we understand it better if we want to improve relationships and interactions and performance and results? And it just struck me that why aren't we doing more research to understand how the brain works, regardless of where you come from, and the similarities behind it more than the differences? I felt like there's a lot of people trying to study the differences behind different neuroscience applications based on neurochemical issues here. We need to study that. Alzheimer's, that we need to study all that. But what about the similarities so that you could put it into process and frameworks to help people be more effective in whatever walk of life they're in? So that's what you and I have. That's like a shared passion, I think.
So you hit two myths here. Busan is talking to executives like, how many of you have been to all kind of conflict resolution classes? Everybody's putting their hand up. Conflict. He said, bad news. It's the worst thing you could be doing is stifling the diversity of thought. So he draws this box on the wall, right? And there's four of us that we all agree in this box. And then he puts this little dot on the right side. And he said, so here's what you ought to be doing as executives leading people for creativity. Take the box of four and move it over to the dot. Don't try to conform the dot into the box.
So true.
Whoa.
Right?
Are you kidding? And so, again, an aha moment of saying, God, we've been doing this all wrong. And so the person outside is the negative one, not the creative one. And so he eliminates that whole notion of conflict. And we've been going to classes, figuring out how to stamp that out. And he says, well, you're stamping out your creativity inside your organization.
Isn't it awesome that when the light bulbs go off and you realize that from the time that we are 3 or 4 years old and we get put into the educational system, we are being conformed to the safety box of convergent thinking in the way we're being educated, trained, and equipped. And then as adults, we're told to be creative and innovative, but we're so conformed to the safety box. And through self-preservation, the four of us that were in the box, we have to be right because we feel safer because there's safety in numbers. And so then we ostracize the person who's a divergent thinker.
You got it.
It's nuts. It's nuts. And so I think these sacred cows that you're continuing to help us sacrifice, I think is awesome.
We call them the wild ducks, right? In IBM, we call them the wild ducks. And I said, yeah. And what we do is we learn how to trap shoot them and shoot them out of the sky. Instead, we ought to be figuring out how to harness those wild ducks and use them. The other myth that he described, this was interesting because he then talks to us, okay, so you guys all think it's the human assets that are your primary goals in the company. So we all fall into that trap. Yes, 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 yes. He says, so can you tell me what the inventory of thinking skills are that exist in the human brain? And like, what the hell is he talking about? And so he comes back, he says, look, I'm sure you've all heard about right brain and left brain. Tell me what the different studies have shown that exist in the cortical skills of the human mind. And we are, now let's just do this as a team. And we are just screwing that all up. I mean, left brain, right brain, the whole brain, whatever. And fast forward, he then eventually showed us what the modalities of thinking were. And Sperry has done this, and Ned Herman. I mean, there's been a lot of research on it. Some of the labels change, but in a sense, that was one chart I took from that class and stuck on my office wall. Because what he showed us, and then he took us through the lives of Walt Disney and Albert Einstein and Leonardo da Vinci. And he said, now I want you to look at their lives. There's a little page that I want you to read as a team and tell me of these 14 modalities, how many of these modalities did all these great creative minds utilize? And you start realizing they were using both sides of their brain, which then blows up the myth, you're a left brain or you're a right brain. And Busan's answer was, you're a whole brain. Jesus, if you're going to be creative, as a finance guy, you're going to walk into a room, and we were doing this. I was a part of that. Stacks of data. Hey, you want to see the numbers? And the marketing and the sales guys would look at it and say, more of the same old, the hell with your damn numbers.
Right.
So the finance guys would listen now to the marketing guys, and they'd shoot them down because, okay, we're not going to make money. So what you had is a crossfire of finance, the numbers guys, with the marketing, sales, creative, the development guys. And we were going nowhere with this because all we had was a shooting gallery, cross shooting.
Yeah, and I love the work that's continued to be done there, from Kahneman and Tversky and the prospect theories and, thinking fast and slow, trying to simplify the brain further into systems, system 1 and 2 versus left and right, because you are using in different ways, analytical thinking versus emotive thinking or feeling, and how those things interact have to me, a much better determinant on how people process that information. You might be an analytical person by nature, but you're still you're an emotional being, right? So you're processing things in a similar order. And I love that the research is starting to see that.
God, Jeff, I got so many things you grab in here. I started reading Joe Ledoux's book on emotional intelligence, and it was Dr. Ledoux at NYU that really was the genesis for Goldman's book on that.
Yeah.
So then I start saying, well, wait a minute, that's another part of the brain. And how does the emotional brain, the amygdala, interface with the cortex? And how do those two come together? And I remember one study reading, and in fact, it was a study published in Time magazine, how your love life impacts your results. Like, what do you mean how your love life? When you have a love for something, the emotional brain will feed the rational brain to figure out the how-to.
Yep.
Well, if you don't have a passion or an energy or an excitement about achieving some outcome, then you're doomed, because what your brain will do is excuse the lack of, and therefore it'll stop running, and you won't get your creativity at its best.
And why, and this is hopefully this comes out the right way. That's why people who are struggling with deep depression are not very productive, because they don't have that emotional passion for something that's pushing them forward for creativity and productivity. And it's a terrifying state of mind to be in when you're in that situation. We know it's neurochemical. We know a lot about that, but for those that are out there that struggle with things like anxiety and depression, and you feel like you're in a funk. We hear people go through these, I'm in a funk. Well, what you're saying is that you've suppressed your emotional part of your brain to the point where there's no passion there to go do something. So then you get stuck in the rut, right?
So then you try to find what's that piece in your life that you could get excited about. Is there anything? God help when people tell you there's nothing, that's the saddest thing.
Right.
So what sometimes you got to do is you got to probe it. You got to dig for it. But here's the bottom line for how this works. So I took this chart, left and right brain, and I used it when I was communicating with executives. I used it when I was communicating with my team. And now that Busan said you need both to have your maximum creativity, I would literally check off, okay, we got the logic, we got the analysis. Do we have the dream? Do we have the gestalt? Do we have the rhythm and the color and the music to go with it? And I would use that as my check off. And if we at least had 10 of the 14, I felt we had to go. If we didn't have 10 or 14, I'd go find somebody that was missing. So I had a guy that worked for me. He was an artist. This guy had color. I'd use him in front of the room. I said, I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to get in front of the room and you're going to draw out everything you hear us talking about. And this guy loved it. And we'd sit there and look at his picture and say, is that what we're talking about? Is that what we're drawing? It was phenomenal. But it was this integration of the cortex and then the emotion that I then began to utilize when I was working with corporate executives. Now, it all tied back to brain-to-brain communication. Okay, when we're communicating with other people, what are the key words that are being spoken and what modality of the cortex is it fitting? And what I learned to do is differentiate the rational brain from the emotional brain. And people often mix them.
Yep.
And they're judging. I mean, there are times that we as a country, we are judging things off the emotion, not off the rationale.
I would say not times. I would say all the time, right? We're looking at that through the emotional lens and then looking for our confirmation bias, then look for the rationalization to justify the thing that we feared or we didn't fear. We'll fill in the blank, right?
You know, I use the example in my workshops of somebody hitting in a car accident, the other person gets out and shoots the other person. What's their intention when they were driving their car that morning to go to jail for 30 years? What happened? Their emotion short-circuited and hijacked their rationale.
Right.
When I look, I did this with a group of country GMs. We were having some problems. We were having some problems with international trade, right? We bring all the general managers in, and I asked them a question: how many of you would like to go to jail? And they look at me like, are you some kind of wise guy? Or you what? And so I turned around, I said, you keep doing what you're doing, and there are a few of you are not going to be general managers anymore. And there were 13 people in the room, and 2 of them were no longer general managers within the next year. Because they were running off their emotion and, hey, you don't understand how we do business in this country. I said, well, I understand what the laws are and you're not following.
Yeah.
And so I've had so many different experiences. And so now I go to hospitals and I'm taking these same principles into doctor's care with patients and families. And I'm starting to find that patients are not always telling the doctors the truth about how they're feeling and what their care is. And I look at the patient and say, this is the person that's going to keep you alive, is going to help you die. You can't lie to them.
Right.
And so the feedback on communication, I think you're hitting that right on, and that's what feeds then your creativity.
I love it, man. This is so much. We could do like 4 episodes just on this one topic, I think, Tony, but unfortunately we're running out of time here. So
okay.
What I want to do is I want to make sure our listeners have the ability to go learn more about all the work that you're doing, where to get your books, where to book you for speaking, where to hire you for consulting. So, and where to learn just more in general. Where can we go to learn more?
Go to my website for DottinoConsulting.com, and that will connect you to the clients and the testimonials and some of the elements of what we're doing. But I'm putting a lot more time now in the USA Memory Championship. So I'll be doing my 24th USA Memory Championship. It's been sponsored by MIT as well. And so my 24th USA Memory is coming up, and I'm doing a lot of work on long-term mental health. And so what are things that people need to have at any age to do the exercising to maintain control over their own mental health and fitness? You can still get the Grassroots Leader book. I use it as a textbook in a lot of my workshops. People have loved it. It's been picked up by 12 different countries. My first book, Brain Smart Leader, is no longer in print, but you can find people selling it sometimes on Google or YouTube. Is it YouTube? It's Google. You can go find it out there. But the book that people have just loved, and executives especially, is the Grassroots Leader book. And that really is almost like a textbook of here are the things that you need to be able to do for your process, for engagement, for customer results. And the word trust comes out of it real clearly, because if people don't have trust in any conversation, then they have a block, and it goes in one ear and out the other, and then they run away from you as fast as they can. And now you've lost the relationship.
Absolutely. We love it. And so if you're listening and you forgot that it's DottinoConsulting.com, then that means you need to get involved in the USA Memory Championship if you've already forgotten what he said about the consulting group website. Now, all the links are in the show notes and on the page. And if you're just driving around, pull over and want to type it in, that's where to go find more. Tony Dottino, Dottino. Google this man. He is a wealth of information. He's leaving a significant legacy of not just high performance in organizations, but changed lives and relationships. And we couldn't thank you enough for being on here and for the influence you've had on people like Dan already and me you're beginning to have. We look forward to a long-lasting relationship with you and have you back on soon.
Likewise, Jeff, thank you. You're inspired it, and thank Dan for it. This has been great. Love it.